Yeah.
Okay, so the hypothalamus is only a small region of the brain. It's located at the base of the brain, very close to the pituitary gland. So as you can see here, there's literally just this little stalk connecting the hypothalamus, which is all of this, to the pituitary gland, which is this structure here. So it is made up of three main regions. You have your anterior, your middle, and your posterior regions. And how I like to remember these regions is by various anatomical structures, because everything is pretty abstract when you actually look at it in anatomy. So if you can locate your infundibulum, which is the stalk here, your optic chiasm, which is this little bulge, and your mammillary body, those are the three demarcations for the three regions. So the anterior region consists of, so the hypothalamus has a bunch of different nuclei, and what the nuclei are basically just clusters of neurons that perform various vital functions, such as the release of hormones. So let's start with the anterior region. It's also known as the supraoptic region, which makes sense because it's right above the optic chiasm, as we said before. So the main nuclei that we want to look at here would be the supraoptic and the paraventricular nuclei. So you see the supraoptic nuclei here. I hope you can see my pointer. And the paraventricular nucleus, which is up here. There are a bunch of other small nuclei, but we're not going to focus on that at all. So the anterior region, it's mainly responsible for releasing many various hormones, such as corticotropin releasing hormone, thyroid releasing hormone, gonadotropin releasing hormone, and these are all important with respects to the anterior pituitary. It also regulates the body temperature and maintains the circadian rhythm. The middle part of your hypothalamus is also known as the tuberal region above this tube-like structure, the infundibulum. And the main nuclei that you need to know here would be the ventromedial and the arcuate nuclei. So right here, you have your ventromedial, and your arcuate nucleus is right here. Next, you have the posterior, also known as the mammillary region, and makes sense again because it's right above your mammillary body. You have your medial mammillary nucleus and your lateral mammillary nucleus, and your posterior hypothalamic nuclei. Okay, moving on. So with everything, you need to know your anatomical positions and relations. They're always going to ask you about this. It's important for surgery, for pathology, because which structures are going to be affected if you have fracture here, etc., stuff like that. So let's talk about the pituitary gland a little bit first before we go into the relations. So the pituitary gland is very small. It's about 1/3 inch in diameter. It's pea-sized and an oval structure suspended from the hypothalamus by this little stalk known as the infundibulum, as we said before. It sits within the sella turcica, which is also known as your Turkish saddle, Turkish seat. It's just this little structure in your sphenoidal bone, and it's enveloped by the dura mater. So if you remember, the brain is covered by three let's call them sheets, right? So you have outermost, you have your dura mater, then you have your arachnoid, then you have your pia mater. And what the diaphragma and what is happening is that your pituitary gland superiorly, the surface, is covered by what is known as your diaphragma sellae. And this is a reflection of the dura mater with a central opening, which allows for the passage of the infundibulum, which is basically the stalk which connects the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. And this stalk is very important because it contains the portal blood vessels, which allows for the communication of various neurotransmitters between the hypothalamus and your anterior pituitary. It also has nerve fibers which connect your hypothalamus to your posterior pituitary, but we're not talking about the posterior pituitary today. All right, so more anatomical positions and relations. So anteriorly and inferiorly to your pituitary gland, you have the sphenoid sinus, and these are just things that you're going to have to learn off. Posteriorly, you have your posterior intercavernous sinus, your dorsum celli, and your basilar artery, as well as your pons. Superiorly, as we said before, you have your diaphragma celli, which is that dura mater envelope, and you have your optic chiasma. And then laterally, which is important, you have your cavernous sinus. You need to know all the structures that are within your cavernous sinus. They love to ask questions on that, especially in your spotters. I don't know if you still have those, but yes, your cavernous sinus, they are lateral to your pituitary fossa, and they contain the third, the fourth, and the sixth cranial nerves, as well as your internal carotid arteries. And you can see them here. You have your third oculomotor nerve, fourth trochlear nerve, and your fifth abducens nerve, which is this little one here, as well as your internal carotid artery. And this, remember that blood supply we talked about, which connects your hypothalamus to your anterior pituitary? It's off of a branch from this internal carotid artery. So we'll talk about that more as we go along. Right. Adrenal hypophysis is just basically another word for your anterior pituitary, and we're going to focus on this more now. So the pituitary gland is made up of two lobes, as we said, the anterior and the posterior, and they're both of different embryonic origins, and thus they function differently. I don't know if you can see this image very clearly, but we're just going to talk about the embryology a little bit. So the stomodium's roof, which you see here, well, here, it's kind of zoomed up here. It's also known as the buccal primordium. It grows cranially, which means upwards, forming the Rathke's pouch. And as it grows up, it forms another structure here known as Rathke's stalk. And this eventually goes on to form your anterior pituitary gland, whereas superiorly here, from the diencephalon, you have part of the diencephalon's floor then grows caudally, which means downwards, forming the pars nervosa, which is your posterior pituitary, with a stalk which develops into your infundibulum. The anterior wall of the Rathke's pouch, which is this, right? It thickens, forming the pars distalis, and then the thinner posterior wall, which is back here, that forms the pars intermedia. And these are all just different words describing or identifying structures of the pituitary gland. The pars nervosa, which is your posterior pituitary, adheres to the pars intermedia, which is this bit here, and that forms the posterior lobe. And then the pars distalis, which is your anterior pituitary, with the pars tuberalis forms the anterior lobe. So you kind of see this occurring as you look down here. And then Rathke's stalk, which is this bit, degenerates. If that remains, you're going to have a bunch of different congenital anomalies forming, and I figure that will be discussed when you have the class on pathology of the anterior pituitary. So this is a diagram going through those structures. So you have your hypothalamus, which is closely related to your pituitary gland by the pituitary stalk or infundibulum. You have your pars tuberalis, your pars intermedia, your pars distalis, and your pars nervosa. So this whole section is your anterior pituitary, and this section here is your posterior pituitary gland. Okay, so the blood supply, and this is important, especially for your anterior pituitary. Your venous drainage is via the anterior and posterior hypophyseal veins, and your arterial supply is via your superior hypophyseal artery. So the superior hypophyseal artery is a branch of the internal carotid artery, which as aforementioned, runs laterally in your cavernous sinus along with the other nerves, right? So this vessel first forms a capillary network around the hypothalamus, and then blood from the hypothalamus, with all these different neurotransmitters, goes into this network and is transported to a secondary capillary plexus, which surrounds your anterior pituitary. So that's how hormones and neurotransmitters from your hypothalamus get into your anterior pituitary, and then binds to various receptors in your anterior pituitary and stimulates it to release its own hormones. And those hormones go to end organs which then bind to their end organs and stimulate them to release other hormones, peripheral hormones, which have a various array of effects on the body, right? So this whole system here with your capillary plexus is known as your hypophyseal portal system. And as we mentioned, it permits the hypothalamus to communicate with the anterior pituitary by the release of various neurotransmitters into the bloodstream. So once those neurotransmitters secreted into the hypophyseal portal vessels reach the anterior pituitary, they bind to cells, and various cells secrete various hormones, and this leads us to the function of the anterior pituitary, which would be to secrete hormones such as adrenocorticotrophin hormone, follicle-stimulating hormone or luteinizing hormone, growth hormone, prolactin, and thyroid-stimulating hormone. So all of these are specific to the anterior pituitary gland, right? Okay, so
Yeah. 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 Yeah.